Welcome to the Opportunity Podcast, where entrepreneurs come to learn from real buyers, sellers, and industry experts on the lesser-known growth opportunities to build their online business empires. We'll uncover tactics veteran online business entrepreneurs have used to build, buy, flip, and sell their way towards personal wealth. Sit back, grab a coffee, and get ready to uncover hidden growth secrets. The Opportunity Podcast starts now.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Opportunity Podcast, your go-to resource for hidden growth opportunities throughout online business. For those familiar or new to the podcast, I'm Sarah, and thanks for joining me today. In this episode, I have Rael, Cline, the co-founder of Nozzle, a platform that helps Amazon sellers unlock LTV and brand performance insights. We all know Amazon isn't the easiest platform to access data critical to growth. Rael explains how it is possible to get a hold of LTV and CAC for Amazon sellers and what that data can do to transform Amazon businesses. We also dig into his experience creating an AI-based solution and discuss how sellers and aggregators can leverage their Amazon data to enhance their sales and due diligence. I don't want to give away too much just yet, so let's go ahead and get started with Rael's interview. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Opportunity Podcast. Today's guest, we have Rael Cline on with us. So Rael, how you doing today?
Yeah, I'm all good. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Yeah, awesome to have you on. So just curious, where are you calling in from in the world right now?
So I'm in London in the UK, which is sunny today. So I'm really grateful for that. I'll be spending some time outside later today. So yeah, London, UK.
Awesome. Well, and for people wondering, is that a British accent? Where is your accent from?
Yeah, it is not a British accent. So I'm originally from South Africa, but I've spent the last about 8 years in London.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Not that I think there's still a lot of people listening who don't know all their accents and they'll go really surprised. Oh, that's South African? I didn't know.
Yeah, it's not a super strong South African accent, but definitely South Africans will know immediately it's South African.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, so I'm just curious, start me off. I'd love to get to know a bit of your past. How did you make your way into the world of online business?
Yeah, so I took a rather circuitous route, I would say. My background is not really in anything online to begin with, at least. So I guess rewinding all the way back, I started off in the world of finance. So I studied finance at university in South Africa. I came to the UK, carried on studying finance, did a master's in finance, all these financial things, and then realized I don't want to be in finance anymore. After working 2 jobs in finance and then studying it further, yeah, as you do, kind of an expensive way to learn that lesson. But I guess the kind of core thing for me was working in finance, at least the jobs that I was doing, more kind of investment banking or private equity type stuff, very advisory based roles, is that companies pretty much exist in a spreadsheet and PowerPoint. For me, it's just not kind of close enough to the action, right? You want to measure your impact. You don't want to measure your impact, a number in a spreadsheet, right? And for me, I really wanted to get into essentially company building. And so in 2013, co-founded a company in London, a company called Media Gamma. And this was an arcane world of online advertising, right? So basically, online advertising still continues today. It's called programmatic advertising. When you visit a website, what's actually going on in the background is whilst the page is loading, there's a real-time auction to show you an ad, right? So a whole bunch of buyers will submit a bid, a winner's chosen, winner's ad gets shown to you, all within, honestly, like 100 milliseconds. Incredible stuff going on behind the scenes. And what was interesting to me was coming from a finance world where, you pretty much have algorithms buying and selling stuff in real time for decades, right? This is selling stocks and shares or bonds or whatever it is, financial securities. And so as soon as I discovered this whole world of programmatic advertising, I immediately went, hey, is there something the finance world can offer this online advertising world? These two industries never really talk to each other. And that's super interesting. And so I tried the initial idea was to apply a lot of these sort of financial techniques or ways of optimizing into the online advertising world. And so I teamed up with a computer science professor at University College London, UCL. So this computer science department is pretty well known, very well known, and has a specific research focus in, believe it or not, e-commerce and online advertising, right? And so they had been writing a whole lot of papers on how to, use financial techniques in online advertising. Long story short, we created a business that used to write custom bidding and selling algorithms for online advertisers. So if I'm a buyer, I want to show an ad to someone, I want to make sure that it's the phrase or the sentence everyone uses, the right person at the right time in the right place kind of thing, right? And so there's a whole sort of area to do that. We built that business up. We ended up selling that business to a long-time customer of ours called Beeswax, based in New York. And then how I arrived on Amazon, in the Amazon world, is if I look back at that business at Media Gamma, the most successful customers were the ones that basically tied the advertising to what happened after the ad, right? And so someone, let's say it's a mobile gaming company, someone clicks on the ad, downloads my game, my app, but then I want to measure what happens afterwards. I want to measure what happens after 3 days, after 10 days, after 6 months. Are they still active? Are they still spending money? What is my profit per customer after 3 months or 6 months? And so really tying the advertising side to, let's say, the retail or the post-purchase side of things. And so that worked really well on the Media Gamma side. And then, thinking about where else can we apply this sort of thinking, and then you kind of quickly land on Amazon, right? Because Amazon clearly growing, right, really, really quickly, but also uniquely positioned in that it's got both the advertising side and products and data together with the retail side. What happens afterwards? So, the Nozzle was kind of a combination, and we can talk about Nozzle and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, Nozzle is a combination of applying that sort of principle to Amazon sellers and figuring out what happens after the ad, right? Or what happens after the first purchase? Do people buy again? How often are they buying? Do they buy the same sorts of products? And so we provide all this sort of information to Amazon sellers to help them grow their businesses. There's a bit of a long answer there.
No, and it's funny because I've got a bunch of kind of follow-up questions on that. Just a total random observation. I just think it's so cool that your computer program allowed you to sort of play within the world of e-commerce. I think it's one place, and maybe it's just me, kind of getting on my soapbox and complaining to the world, but I do think that universities, they tend to be so weak on what I feel like is needed to kind of move forward in the digital sphere, whether that's e-commerce, SaaS skills, actual digital marketing. I suppose that's almost feels an antiquated phrase. Yeah. And look, it sounds forward thinking.
Yeah, I totally agree with you in general that, universities, to be clear, my experience with UCL is really good. They're super helpful. They knew what they didn't know, right? Which is really important. But yeah, you definitely hear stories from other people working with other universities. Could be in the UK, could be US or wherever really, where it's a much, much tougher process around, how do I take, essentially some of it is intellectual property, the IP, right? Could be of the professors or the students or the department, whatever it is. And how do I commercialize those sort of things? And yeah, it can be a tricky process, but as I say, mine was a very good process, but it's not typically, universities generally are used to licensing things. They're not really skilled up for spinouts, right? Actually creating companies and building companies. They're traditionally at least, much happier to collect a royalty check or something for licensing their IP.
That's so interesting. I mean, I read a really interesting stat. There was a guy that wrote a book about kind of like another pathway outside of college. It's such a big thing in the States. There's not many pathways outside of going to uni. And he surveyed professors and they were asked, how important is it to you that your students get a job out of college? Many of them, it was a very, very low priority for them.
Yeah. I mean, I can talk a lot about this. I totally agree. It's basically the incentives are just very different, right? Like a lot of professors, what they care about is, how often they're publishing, how often they're cited in other papers. A lot of professors don't even like teaching, right? And, as I said, they're just very focused on their own work, their own legacy, their own domains and citations and grants at the end of the day. How do I get grants for this research? And yeah, so I'm totally not surprised by all of that. And frankly, it's a completely different skill set, right? What makes a really good researcher is so different to what makes a good educator and a good teacher, right? Like actually mashing together these two things and expecting the same person to do both with pretty much no training. No wonder that, the answers were very low, right?
Yeah, no, you're totally right on that. I think that's the thing that frustrates me because there's so many terrific opportunities in this very varied space.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of students don't even know it exists. So in any case,
agreed.
Kicks me up. I just want to say, I think you're super lucky to have gotten that and obviously look at where you are today.
Agreed.
A couple things. I know we're going to talk a lot about Nozzle and what you're doing throughout this episode, but I wanted to start with a little bit of like the why and the challenge that you set out to face. So maybe this is your soapbox moment. I just want to ask about Amazon and what the challenges are for Amazon sellers when it comes to data and accessing that data around their customers.
Yeah. So a couple things. I mean, in general, Amazon is making more data available to sellers, right? If you look in the last sort of 2-3 years, there's no doubt that they are releasing more things, whether that's on the brand analytics side, which was, only been available really for a couple of years or so. The challenge, though, is two things. Number one, the data is often incomplete or very, very difficult to stitch together, right? I have to download 4 different reports. Some of it overlaps with each other, but has different definitions. And so it's just actually really difficult to pick out what data is the most useful. How do I stitch it together? How do I do this every month? And the other part of it is specifically on the customer side, mostly by design, right? Amazon makes it very difficult to understand anything about who's buying from you. I mean, they're very, very clear, obviously, on kind of the legal side or the terms of service side. Amazon will own the customer and the customer data and the sort of things that you might be used to doing on a D2C or Shopify type environment. You certainly can't do on Amazon, right? You can't sort of reach out. Quickest way to get suspended on Amazon is, trying to communicate with them that isn't to do with fulfilling an order or, something like that. So, so it's mostly by design. Again, if you take a step back and, wider environment for Amazon sellers is pretty tough this year, right? And this idea of, not selling products, but ultimately you need to be able to build a brand on Amazon to succeed. And it's no longer good enough just to sell some collection of ASINs. And our view is, well, there are many ways, I guess, to go about building a brand, but surely understanding your customers, who they are, their preferences and buying habits and all those sorts of things is certainly going to be a massive part of that. And so that's really the big challenge, is that we believe ultimately to succeed, you need to be able to build a brand on Amazon. But actually, how do you do that without knowing anything about your customers, right? That's a severe challenge. And that's what we're addressing at Nozzle.
Yeah, no, it's huge. I mean, I've had people come onto the show and talk about it. It's kind of like I hear the fire in their voice of like almost this, even after they've been successful on the platform for a long time, they're looking at other opportunities. They're like, gosh, do I just land in this platform? Do I go Shopify where I can have a little bit more control? It's a frustrating place to be in, despite being quite lucrative when you can get something rolling. So I did want to talk about like the solution, especially for these helpless, let's call them helpless Amazon sellers. How did you set out to help them overcome the challenges of data?
Yeah, our core competency is understanding the data sets, the shape of the data, how to stitch these things together. So we spent over a year, 1.5 years even, really plugging into all the data sources via Amazon's APIs. So this is just a software-based way to draw down a lot of the data, perhaps you would Seller Central, for instance. And then we spent a lot of time, as I say, kind of stitching this together. And, we've built up relationships with people within, let's say, the Amazon team. So you've got, let's say, an advertising data set, and then you've got the retail data set, perhaps some of the purchase data, I don't know, whatever it may be. And then you're trying to figure out how to stitch these things together. And then it's not really clear. And so you need to, try to get some clarity from people within Amazon on what this thing actually means. And so it's a lot of work. It's really tough and it's constantly changing. But we've been able to ultimately stitch these things together. So you can join some of the advertising data sets with the retail data sets. And that kind of goes back to the Media Gamut day of where I said it's not enough to show someone download an app. You kind of want to measure the whole journey, right? From like the Holy Grail is to have their first exposure, right? They saw this ad on day 0, then saw another ad on day 3, clicked it, then bought something from you on day 5, and then bought again from you on day 30 and bought again from you on day 90, right? Like that whole customer journey is just so important. And if you're used to selling on Shopify in the D2C world, it's still difficult to do, particularly, I guess, maybe on the advertising side. But certainly once someone's bought from you and repeat buys from you, there are a lot of tools to understand exactly what's going on there. And we wanted to bring that parity to Amazon sellers, right? So for us, it's about understand. We can talk about what are the key metrics here. I mean, ultimately for us, there's probably 2 or 3 key metrics. Number one being this idea of customer lifetime value, or profit per customer, as we call it. And really, that's just almost a fundamental business. Almost every business that has customers needs to understand how profitable a customer is. And are my newer customers as profitable as my older customers? All these sorts of questions. At Nozzle, we do this exact same thing. People who buy our software, we're measuring how profitable is this customer over their entire lifetime with us, be that 12 months, 24 months, whatever it may be. So that customer lifetime value is an absolute key metric. And if you're doing this on Shopify, then you've got significant advantages. The flip side of that is this idea of customer acquisition cost. And so that is how much I can spend to acquire a new customer. And so these two things work in tandem, of course, because we're saying, hey, after 6 months, your total profit per customer, for instance, might be, let's say, $30, which basically means I can spend up to $30 to acquire a new customer if I'm prepared to wait 6 months to break even. And so using these two metrics that are quite ubiquitous, I would say, in the wider e-commerce world, just not on the Amazon seller world, because it's historically been really, really tough to do. Bringing that into the Amazon world has been a real big game changer for a lot of our customers who obviously sell products that lend themselves to repeat orders, right? So anything food or drink related or supplements, pet products, health and beauty, all those sort of categories, you would expect some repeat orders. Having this data, again, happy to go into as much detail as you'd like, pretty much fundamentally changes how you want to run your Amazon business because, certain products might have a much higher lifetime value than you thought. And so I need to put more resources into this particular product, right? So yeah, we can chat about all those things, but it's sort of an overview over there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you kind of going through and defining some of those terms. I did want to talk about it because I'm sure Amazon listeners could be listening in on this and going, oh my gosh, I want that holy grail of data like you were just talking about. I think if I was an Amazon seller, that would catch my attention. So let's dig into that some. You started talking to me about it somewhat, but I'd love to get a little bit more granular. Talk to me about some of the ways that Amazon sellers can optimize that LTV and CAC. What are things that they can tangibly start doing?
Yeah, so we'd break it down into each one of those components, right? Actually, I forgot to say, we're never going to show you, it was Sarah who bought this product, and this is what Sarah did over the last, 6 months, and that's obviously very much against Amazon's terms of service, right? We're going to show you data that says on average somebody does this, or for people who first bought from you in July of 21, this is how they've progressed up until this point. So there's nothing personally identifiable that comes out there. And so it's, strictly remains within Amazon's terms of service. There's no, as I say, we're not telling you specifically what Sarah has done. So that's kind of the terms of service issue there. But to answer directly your question, what are the ways to optimize for these things? Let's start with the lifetime value side. The LTV side is ultimately saying, what is my total profit per customer over a particular period of time? So it could be 6 months, 12 months, whatever it may be. And it's important that this is done on an actual profit basis, right? You're not just adding up the sales that you get from an individual or on average, it's the actual profit. So you need to know, your cost of goods sold or your landed cost or whatever it is, and you're doing that on an actual profit basis. How do you increase that? Well, there are kind of 2 or 3 things that you can do to increase that. Clearly, getting them to buy again is the biggest thing, but increasing the average order value would be one way of doing that. Getting a better margin. So often what we see is people perhaps first buy a low margin product, and then you're able to sell them a higher margin product further down the road, right? And so that's another way of increasing your lifetime value. Or another way of doing it is getting them to buy more frequently. So those are kind of the 3 levers you would have to help increase the lifetime value. Now, some of these things might be quite difficult to do on Amazon. Like if you're Shopify and you've got your, Klaviyo stack and you can remind people about abandoned carts or, send them emails when you launch a new product, all those sort of things to get them to buy again. Amazon doesn't quite have those sorts of tools, although it is changing a little bit. And so it's a bit of a tangent here, but Amazon has a beta product called the Customer Engagement Tool. And they're kind of breaking a bit of a cardinal rule here. For the first time, you're actually able to email a person who is following your brand on Amazon if you have a product launch. And so that's really interesting to us because that means someone who's following your brand on Amazon can say, hey, I've launched this new product, go buy that. That definitely obviously helps with sending it to existing customers to increase their lifetime value and get a closer relationship ultimately with the brand. But the precedent that Amazon has set, yes, it's still in beta, right? And whether this makes it out of beta or they attach new use cases to it is another question. But this is super interesting because if they're going down this route of being able to contact customers for very specific use cases or reasons, that is definitely going to have a massive impact on your lifetime value. So those are the kind of levers on the lifetime value side. Being able to, another one would be back on the advertising. You can remarket to customers, right? Someone who's bought, if someone buys, roughly every 30 days or every 60 days, you can retarget them or remarket to them via sponsored display ads or Amazon's DSP to effectively nudge them to go buy again or encourage a subscribe and save sign up, things like that. So those are some ways to increase the lifetime value. If you're on the customer acquisition cost side, on the CAC side, then I mean, again, this is the definition or the explanation of this is how much do I have to spend to acquire a new to brand customer? And you can measure this in multiple ways. A kind of simple but effective way of doing it is just adding up all the advertising, sponsored brands, sponsored display, sponsored products, for instance, your DSP, if you're using any DSP, and dividing that by the number of new to brand customers that you get in a given month, let's say. And so that's literally how much am I spending to acquire a new to brand customer. And so you're always going to be comparing this to your lifetime value. And so how do you control your customer acquisition cost? Well, it's ultimately to do with how you're spending the money on the advertising and whether you're actually converting those new to brand customers, right? Those are the two levers you have there. And on the ad spend side, it's got to do with your keywords ultimately. Like, what keywords are you going after? Are they high volume? Are they category ones? CPCs in general, obviously increasing a lot on Amazon across the board. That's not going to change anytime soon. But the power of the customer acquisition cost and the LTV is a lot of people who thought, you have this idea of a break-even ACOS, right? Which is effectively your pre-advertising margin, right? How much am I making on a sale before any advertising costs? And therefore, my break-even, ACOS might be 20%. I can't go above 20%, otherwise I'm not going to make a profit. But using the LTV all of a sudden means, hey, I thought my break-even ACOS was 20%, but I know somebody buys 3 times in a year from me. So it's actually gone up to 60%, for instance. And using that new break-even ACOS is really, really powerful. That means that, hey, I actually thought I could only spend, $5 to acquire a new customer. Turns out I can spend $15 to acquire a new customer, which now means back on the PPC side, I can go after, certain keywords that I thought were out of reach, right? I can afford to be much more aggressive on that and go after those very high volume, high CPC terms, knowing that I'm going to break even in 3 months or 6 months or whatever you choose to optimize for. So that's kind of the main kind of core use case that a lot of our customers would use us for in those particular categories, right? Something that has decent repeat purchases. All of a sudden you thought you could only afford a particular CPC. Turns out it's a hell of a lot higher if you just wait 3 months to break even.
Is there like a particular data set that when you go about finally giving this over to FBA sellers, they seem to be most surprised by?
Yeah, I mean, quite often it's interesting. Like, quite often we would, just because a product has a high volume of sales doesn't mean that your most valuable customers are buying it. It depends what you want to optimize for ultimately, but it's more often than you would think your most valuable customers are not buying your most like high volume product, or they might, but it's not like their first or second purchase, that kind of thing. And so that's quite interesting. If you just want to rank well, we're not suggesting, you tweak that product all that much, but it's just depends. If you're very sort of profitability focused, then you probably want to shift the focus a little bit to the products that your most valuable customers are actually buying. Whereas if you're more just bottom line, sales driven or, gross profit driven or whatever it is, then sure, then you can carry on emphasizing that, the high volume one, but pretty much people that just buy once from you.
It's so interesting, everything you're saying. To me, I'm like, I hear this and I think tectonic shift. Like, that's the first thing that comes to my head. We're talking about like what Amazon sellers can do that they weren't previously able to do, what they can access, how they can shift. What you were saying about the beta capability to outreach followers of your brand, I was like, ooh, ears perked up about that. That's huge. I almost feel like it's Amazon shifting. Not to say that they've all been that much on seller side before. We know that they're very much more like customer driven, but almost a way to go, okay, fine. Like, we actually have to give you an olive branch here. We have to give you something in order to keep you happy on the platform. Maybe I'm making that up. You can tell me differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there's a wider trend on Amazon to help you build a brand, right? The shift that I was saying earlier from selling products to actually building a brand. As I say, Amazon has done there's brand analytics that helps you do quite interesting things around, when someone clicks on your product, doesn't buy it and buys something else, what are the top 3 products they'll end up buying? Or what are people comparing your product to? So there's like really interesting data. And that's been around for, a couple of years, I guess. And if people come, they've recently released more storefront metrics. So if someone comes to your store, then they're giving you some information kind of on a store level around traffic and where they're coming from and what they're clicking on and all that. So yes, they're certainly releasing more information about kind of building a brand point of view. The trouble is, you kind of think, they're useful in some way, but like getting to that point of figuring out how to use it, they don't do a good job of that, right? And so that's kind of, I guess, the opportunity for tool providers like us to come in and say, well, this is how we think you should use this data. This is what it means for your business. Because Amazon's, as I said, they're good at providing data. They're not really good at providing the insights piece.
Yeah, the how, like you said, I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. And actually, did you know that if you combine this piece of data with that piece of data, then you've got a better picture, all of that sort of stuff. They're not particularly good with that.
Yeah. Well, talk to me just on the data front. I understand that there's this ongoing and deep relationship with AI to accessing this data. I mean, I've been looking at AI and how it's been slowly but surely this omnipresent kind of focus within our industry through different monetizations. We're dealing with a lot of different monetizations at Empire Flippers, for example. But I'm curious, tell me about your relationship with AI, how it comes to play in your solution, and what is it enabling you to uniquely do?
Really good question. So again, AI can be a bit of a polarizing topic. It's quite misunderstood, I would say. You can ask 10 people what they think it means and you'll get 10 different answers. I have quite a lot of experience with this with MediaGamma, with the previous business, right? Like when I say we were building custom bidding and selling algorithms, these were very much AI driven. And so really what AI is good at doing is effectively making predictions, right? And picking up on patterns that humans would find very difficult to find. And obviously repeating that and doing that at scale and all of that sort of thing. One of the challenges with AI, at least for most of the techniques you're going to be using, is you need huge amounts of data to what they call train a model on. If you're learning, one of the, I guess, perhaps an easier use case to understand is everyone uses an email, Gmail or something like that. And how does it know that whether something's spam? Right? And it automatically goes into spam. And so they have enormous data sets that will classify an email as spam or not spam. And they train a model to recognize spam or not spam. So when a new email comes in, it's using that algorithm to say, hey, this is spam or it's not spam. So that's kind of the most popular ways of training models and relying on historical data. So with us, we're using the Amazon data. Anyone connects to a tool provider in the Amazon, and the APIs actually allow one to go back 2 years on the retail side. Advertising side is a bit different. It's only 60 days, but 2 years worth of data is a really good data set to go train particular models. And for us, it's more about, again, thinking about what are the most useful predictive tasks. In the Amazon world, when you think about AI, everyone kind of defaults to, a bidding algorithm, right? If I'm back on the bid management piece, should I submit a bid of, $3 or $3.50? Should I aim for top of search? You can do that. Those are quite difficult problems. And one of the big insights I think we had in the previous business at MediaGamma is AI is all well and good, but if you can't explain why it's making a particular decision, particularly when things don't go well, then people are going to hate your product, right? So that transparency around decision making is just so important there, because when a user of your product, something doesn't go right and they can't explain to their colleague or their boss or whatever it is, or their client even, why it's all gone wrong, then that's the quickest way to get someone to stop using your product. And so for us, it's not thinking about necessarily, we don't do bid management, but it's not those sorts of problems. For us, we're actually trying to do things like predict lifetime value. Given that, somebody first bought this product, what do we think, the lifetime value of this person's going to be? Are they going to be super valuable? What does their purchase journey look like? And so we've got a lot of data to try and make those sort of predictions. And then, you can do things that this group of people that bought for the first time in April, we think have very high propensity to have a high lifetime value. You should really look at remarketing to this cohort of people because it's going to pay a lot of dividends. So it's more actually on that sorts of use cases than should I submit $3 or $3.20 or, that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's just
sorry, it's a little bit in the weeds with all of that, but
no, I love it. Yeah. I love hearing about it. It's so interesting because I think, as you said, a golden quote there that I would not be able to repeat back verbatim, but just the ability to have clarity and clear up the ambiguity around this, what AI is doing within your company, what you're offering.
Really important.
You're going to turn people off. Huge.
It's actually very interesting because I think maybe 5 years ago, people used to just always advertise the fact that they're doing AI, a lot of hype about it, all that sort of stuff. And it's genuinely transformational. There's no doubt about that. But what's interesting to me is a lot of people in the Amazon seller community are quite skeptical of AI, right? It's just sort of smokes and mirrors and hiding behind stuff. And to be honest, I think they have a point, right? A lot of people claim that they're doing AI that, A, it might not be AI, and that's kind of maybe less relevant. Number two, it's just this transparency issue. They've been burned by, this automation that you have no transparency into how it's making these decisions, and you can't stop it or debug it in any way. And that's just a really, really important, I guess, lesson we learned early on.
I love that. Yeah, as you're talking about it, it's like everyone's saying they're using AI, but like, what does that even mean? Are they actually? Because I think I saw a couple brands yesterday, and it just so happened every single one of them were like, we are powered by AI. And I was like, I'm so curious what that looks like for you, for all of you.
and another thing, this is also a little bit maybe contrarian a bit. A lot of problems don't need an AI solution to them, right? They can be solved with a decent level of accuracy using much more simple techniques that allow you to move a lot quicker, right? You can be 80% accurate doing a much more basic non-AI regression or whatever it is. We can get into the weeds and all that stuff. But yeah, just a much more simple solution that allows you, it's pretty transparent on what its limitations are, where its advantages are. You can explain this to colleagues, but hey, I can do this in like 2 days and I'm 80% accurate. And so if you really want to get an AI-based solution, how useful is it to go from like 80 to 85% accurate or 80 to 90% accurate? Is it really going to move the needle given all the extra time, resources, issues with transparency, all of that sort of stuff, right? And so, yeah, I would definitely, the first thing for me is like we have as a data science team or whatever it is, and with selecting what sort of problems to work on, the first question is always like, why is this uniquely solved by AI, right? Like, why do we think we can't just get this done in a much more simple non-AI way?
Yeah, I think what came to my mind as you were talking about it is like there's a degree of control that you lose. Like you have the ability to get lost in the algorithm. And when you can't pull that out, when something goes wrong, it's like, well, everyone's dead in the
Absolutely.
water.
And so one of the most popular techniques in AI, you would have probably heard about things called deep learning. That is notoriously opaque. And one of the big sort of research areas trying to make it lesser, basically, that's just a question of like, turning up like millions and tens of millions of knobs, a tiny amounts at any given time, all at the same time to get a particular outcome. It works, but hey, I can't really explain why it works. It just seems to be accurate.
It makes me think Greg, our director, showed us this. It's like, what is it? Google Dreaming. And like, it's just this endless array of cats or like eyes. And we don't know why it's doing what it's doing, but it really is cats right now. Like that to me is what I think of, like losing yourself in AI.
Yeah. And so with the commercial hat on, an absolute, if you're building a business around AI, you need a really, really good reason why this problem is uniquely solved by AI. It is also very, very difficult to build a business with AI simply because, as I said, are you sure you're going to get those data sets to train your models, right? Are those data sets available to everybody else? So what's your edge really? Number two, it's super, super expensive, right? Like you need to hire a whole engineering team just to look after the AI component, plus all the data scientists as well, which obviously are pretty expensive too. So yeah, sometimes I guess I learned the lesson the hard way on all of this stuff, but that's our view of AI. And often it's the small things in the background that are happening that, make your life a lot easier. Like, honestly, might seem like a simple example, but autocompletes are AI, right? That's just a complete user experience thing where it gets you've noticed Google Docs lately is doing a lot of more autocompletes when I'm writing documents. That's completely AI driven. And that's, it doesn't have to be these like, as I keep going back to it, but that example of, is it $3 or $3.20 or $3.01 and all that sort of stuff. A lot of the stuff is just autocompletes, filling stuff out in the background, making your product a lot more delightful to use and, all those sort of things. So yeah, that's, I guess, my view on AI.
No, I love it. I know we kind of went down like a whole different direction there, but I think you're putting your money where your mouth is, like you clarifying where most people just say, well, I use AI and hey, that's good enough because I know that you don't have the technical skills to understand what I'm doing. So, I've got the AI babysitters. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I've got the engineers and the data scientists.
Yeah. It always comes back to the question of like, why are you using AI? Like, why is it uniquely solved using AI? And, just because it's more accurate, I can actually get to a fairly accurate number a lot quicker, a lot easier with the transparency. Like, why justify that incremental investment in risk?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this ties in. I understand that you have been able to work with some aggregators,
Yeah.
while working at Nozzle or running Nozzle. I'm so curious, is the data that aggregators are interested in, I mean, is it kind of in this same realm that we've been talking about? Or do they just have like a whole other way that they leverage data in their either due diligence or beyond?
Yeah, so the core use case is about customer lifetime value, customer acquisition cost, what are your customer retention rates? That is definitely still very applicable for aggregators. And the two use cases, as you alluded to there, number one is on the due diligence side, obviously. Like if I'm deciding to put in an offer to buy a particular business, one of the ways we would work with an aggregator is part of the due diligence process, we would give them the data to say things like, hey, actually, if I'm paying, and I'm making up numbers here, 5 or 10 million or whatever it is to go buy a business, what is that on a per customer basis, right? I'm paying, I don't know, $150 per customer or something like that. And then I'm able to compare that to the lifetime value of that customer. And so if the lifetime value is, let's say, $100, but I'm actually paying $150 per customer, then I'm paying a 50% premium on the lifetime value. And so I need to think really, really carefully if I'm going to submit that, do the deal at that price. Do I really think I'm going to increase the lifetime value by 50% to justify paying this price to acquire this business? And so it's quite a fundamental way of valuing the business, a different way of looking at it as well. To be fair, some aggregators will certainly have the capability of, they think they can increase the LTV significantly. The product might not be run, they might have had supply chain issues or rebrand issues or whatever it is, or just introducing a lot more SKUs into the process. And so you can continually get more purchases per customer that way. But it just quantifies what impact you need to make in order to justify the purchase price. And also, go back to the brand building point, it's kind of hard to quantify, I guess, how good a brand is. But again, the loyalty numbers are quite revealing in that way. So sure, you can look at like subscribe and saves, but another way of doing that is just looking at your customer retention rates. I mean, a certain type of customer is going to subscribe and save, but I repeat buy all the time on Amazon, but I don't ever subscribe and save to any of it, right? And so when we're measuring customer retention rate, how loyal are your customers or how good a brand do you actually have? The retention rates become really important there as well. So that's kind of on the due diligence side. If it's post-acquisition and you've bought the business, a lot of the time pretty much all the time it's about growth and saying, what are the main levers we can use to grow this brand? Some of it's going to be just Amazon. Some of it's going to be multi-channel stuff, different marketplaces or D2C or whatever you're going to kind of incorporate as well. But a lot of it for us is just thinking about back to kind of the customer acquisition cost side of things, right? And saying, hey, you've got such strong loyalty and repeat buys that your customer lifetime value is really, really high. You can actually afford to be much more aggressive on the customer acquisition side because you know that the average profit per customer is $100 after 12 months. And if you're an aggregator particularly, you're going to have quite a strong balance sheet, right? Like you can afford to wait 12 months to break even. You can afford to wait 2 years to break even in a lot of cases, where a lot of your competitors don't. They don't have that luxury. And so, if you're just patient, be more aggressive, that's often quite a potent growth lever to help grow the business. And we can single out particular products that are the best for that, right? So for instance, we would say, you've got 100 SKUs. These 3 SKUs have at least 75% of all their sales are coming from repeat buys, right? That's a super, super strong starting point to invest a whole lot more into this particular SKU on new customer acquisition, right? And so a lot of these might be your top tier sellers, but some of them are actually just mid-tier SKUs, but have such strong repeat purchase characteristics that we think we can grow them 5x or something in the next year if you just focus on new customer acquisition. So those are some of the strategies we would work with the aggregators on.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think it ties into my next question because you're talking about the ability for these aggregators to kind of build their brands in, I would say, a more dynamic and data-driven way. And I know that you, just tying back to something you said way early on when the podcast started, you were talking about how important brand building is on the platform, but you hinted that this upcoming year, things are going to be a little bit more challenging in that sense. And I did want to talk to you about that because I feel like there's some interesting stuff there. I mean, I'm curious your take, what do you see as like the trends or changes taking place in Amazon over the next year? And you really think it's going to be more challenging to create a successful FBA business?
The short answer is yes. I think there are a lot of headwinds, right? Like, firstly, you've got stuff that's happening just within the Amazon universe. So for instance, you've got things like the referral fees are increasing in some marketplaces, right? And that's just straight out of your bottom line. You've got stuff that's outside of the Amazon realm. So you've got all the massive supply chain issues, which are going to pretty much remain, I think, the entire year anyway, right? So manufacturing lead times, and this is particularly bad for Amazon sellers. If you run out of stock, you lose your ranking, right? You pretty much disappear from Amazon. So you pay a heavy, heavy price for not having stock. And so, yeah, managing supply chains is a massive thing. Then, of course, you've got all the new capital coming into the industry. So via aggregators or other types of roll-ups where, they're obviously buying all the brands and scaling them. So if you're an FBA seller and one of your competitors gets bought by one of these aggregators, then, what do? How do you compete? It says, they're going to have much deeper pockets. In some ways, you could say a bigger team working on the brand and all that sort of stuff. So, what do you actually do about that? So, yeah, I do think, and of course, as a result of increased competition and more money and all that sort of thing, CPCs are increasing as well, right? And so it's getting harder and harder to be successful on Amazon. It's getting harder and harder to break even on that first purchase. And one of the ways out of this, I mean, of course, I would say this given the product we built, but we really firmly believe it and have seen a lot of success with it, is to not break even on that first purchase, right? This is a very familiar tactic if you're selling D2C. You've got the data to kind of tell you how to do this in the Shopify world, for instance. But up until now, Amazon sellers haven't had the data to do the same thing. And so, yeah, this idea of saying, hey, I'm going to break even on the second purchase, and here's all the data to prove exactly what my affordability is and how much I need to invest to do that, and how long I have to wait for that to happen, all of those sort of things. And that's definitely a way to succeed, not just against aggregators, I should say, just in general, right? And ultimately, look, the simplest thing to say is if you don't have a good product, you're not going to be successful anyway, right? This all presupposes you've got a decent product there. You can dig into as much data as you like, you can spend as much money as you like. If your product ain't good, then you're going to fail. But yeah, I think that is a very good tactic to help succeed in 22 and beyond. Another thing I've seen is if you're looking to start out as an FBA seller, you might want to avoid some of the categories that the aggregators are really like, for instance, right? If you want to kind of minimize sort of that. I mean, this is also more of, I guess, strategic point as well. On the one hand, aggregators can be long-term focused, right? Because they've obviously raised so much money that you can afford to be patient and break even in 6 months or 12 months, whatever it is. But actually, on the other hand, the way they've raised the money with the huge amounts of debt as part of the equation means that they obviously have to service the debt every month. And so depending on the aggregator, they might not have that luxury of being patient, right? Because they can't afford, they have to show the profitability a lot quicker in order to pay off the debt. So that's, again, getting into a bit of a niche use case there. But yeah, I mean, those are the things I would think about in how to compete on Amazon. Look, I mean, every seller, I think, should never just be wholly reliant on Amazon anyway, right? I mean, it's a great place to get your initial traction. They've got better brand building tools. That's great. But just as a general business rule, you should never build your business on one platform, right? You need to hedge yourself ultimately.
Yeah. It's so funny. I think we've accidentally gone full circle where, we kicked off the podcast talking about, okay, give me this soapbox on why Amazon is challenging. And then when we talk about the future of Amazon, it's kind of within the same vein of, like you said, there's a lot of potential, but you have to just be cognizant of just so many other things coming down the pipeline. Not to be negative in any way, but I think you've made out a very good case scenario for, hey, there are tools in your arsenal to be able to pivot, to be able to know what to do if your competition gets acquired, and what does that mean for you to try to compete, so on and so forth.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely a lot there. Well, again, not to make it seem negative by any sense, but I've loved being able to hear your take and what it is you're offering. I think this is relevant to every person selling on Amazon going I really wish that I had more control of my data and understood what to do with it. And the fact that you come through and provide that how is fantastic. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing a bunch of that today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And, always happy to chat about these sort of topics. I can carry on for ages about all of this stuff. So if anyone wants to reach out and got specific questions, I'm always up for a chat.
Awesome. Before we close out, I'd love to wrap these up with rapid fire questions, if you're cool with that.
Of course, yeah.
Awesome. So my first one is, what do you think are the best hidden growth opportunities within Amazon FBA?
Yeah, so this one is maybe a little bit controversial, but you've got a good position in your niche, right? Like you're, I don't know, number 1, 2, or 3 or something like that. We've actually seen sellers be successful increasing their prices? It's pretty counterintuitive, but if you've got the loyalty in there and you've got, a good brand and a decent market position, you can spend ages, trying other riskier things. And, I would never advocate doing it for like your bestseller, right? Like you definitely want to be testing this with, I don't know, tier 2 or 3 sort of SKU. But we've definitely seen people be quite successful about increasing their prices immediately. And that's one of the quickest ways to grow.
Awesome. I like that one. What would you say are tools or resources that can help people to optimize their LTV and CAC?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you can still do this if you're plugged into Amazon's APIs. You can do this if you get the data into sort of a business information tool, BI tool like Looker or Tableau, even Google's version as well. You can do this. Some of the calculations might be a little bit tricky, but there's plenty of literature like on our blog or elsewhere as well. You can do pretty decent approximations with this. And so, yeah, I mean, that's, I think, is a very DIY option to do that. But we just think it's so impactful that it's definitely worthwhile doing it at least as a once-off, if not we would say at least as a quarterly thing, but even as a once-off, just to get a handle on where you are on that spectrum, doing it in a manual way is certainly worthwhile there. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the DIY version of that. Clearly, we do something like that. And to be honest, there actually aren't many other tools within the Amazon world specifically that provide this sort of data.
Yeah, awesome. Well, no, I mean, I appreciate this sort of DIY version, but still understanding that it's an interesting space. There's not many solutions. So it's great that you guys have been able to come in and fight that battle, I suppose.
Exactly.
So final question, sometimes the hardest one. What has been your funniest moment working within Amazon?
There are quite a few, right? I mean, it's the wide world of Amazon, the Wild West. So kind of two things. I'd say just number one, looking at the sort of sellers that sign up, it's just really funny. But like in one case, we had within 5 minutes of each other, we had a bookseller of like basically religious books, right? So covering the major religions sign up. And with 5 minutes later, we had a seller of basically sex toys sign up as well. And it's just like, this is what you get in the Amazon world, right? And then we provide like an account audit on the advertising as well. And it's just funny because very quickly become an expert in like, you talk about niche, right? Like niche sort of bras and stuff like that. And I just remember, a family member coming past my screen and seeing like, PowerPoint presentation with all these sort of things. And it's like, do we need a, should we have a discussion or something? No. I'm all of a sudden an overnight expert in this particular niche, but it's great. I mean, I love the seller community and, people are super open, friendly, happy to share things. And you'd be amazed what sells well on Amazon as well, right?
Yeah, it's so funny. You do accumulate just the most random knowledge you would have never anticipated.
Can't believe it.
When you left finance years ago, you're like, I am going to specialize in bras one day. I'm going to know a lot about that.
Yeah. And then I can tell you about the customer buying habits of bras or the loyalty habits of bras and, most popular sizes and, designs. I mean, you can't, all of that stuff, which is quite, if you asked me a few years ago, would I be an expert in that thing? Never in a million years, right? No. But it's great.
That's the beauty. Like you said, Amazon is kind of a microcosm of the whole world. Anything and everything you can find.
Exactly. And also going through the search term report in brand analytics, right? So that's say on a daily basis, we'll give you the top, whatever it is, over 1 million now, I guess, search terms on Amazon. What's the number 1, 2, and 3 sort of click term and all that sort of stuff. And just, you'd be amazed at what the perennial good ranking terms are versus the seasonal ones. And weird correlations coming up. I won't go into too much detail on that, but like even misspelled versions of some, terms are just consistently at like, number 4.
It reminds me that the internet is a weird place. It's a weird place in a weird world.
Yeah, it is. It's a reflection of humanity, right? That's it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Exactly.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rael, for coming on and just walking us through so much today. I've loved how much we've been able to cover. I think this is going to be really helpful for our audience. So really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great. I went into quite a bit of detail with some of these things. So if anyone wants any additional questions or clarifications or whatever it is, please reach out to me. I'm very happy to have a chat about all of this.
Awesome. So is the best way to reach you on Nozzle or is there anywhere else?
LinkedIn's probably the best, or just an email. So rael.cline, rael.cline @nozzle.ai. Yeah, those are the two best ways.
Brilliant. All right. Well, awesome. I'm sure there'll be people with burning questions after this episode. So I'm excited to see what comes out for you. Thank you again for giving me your time today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I hope you've walked away with a bit of new insight that'll help you in your digital entrepreneurship journey. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating review. To learn more about businesses available for sale at Empire Flippers, click the link in the description or visit empireflippers.com/marketplace. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.